Hey friends, it's Rabbi Jenny Solomon from Beth Meyer Synagogue with a mincha moment on a Wednesday. That's how it happened this week, but I'm so glad to be with you and to share some reflections on this moment in Jewish time. Hopefully a moment of pause and some spiritual inspiration. So I'm thinking a lot about counting the Omer as we are in the final stretch, all the way back from the second night of Pesach when we began counting the Omer, and now approaching Shavuot, which is on the horizon when we celebrate receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the first thing that I want to just reflect on for my own practice is that the counting of the Omer has become one of my favorite Jewish spiritual practices over the last couple of years. And in particular, I'm thinking maybe like the last 3 years, I've been so deeply immersed in it and so proud and satisfied that I could maintain this mindfulness practice throughout the entire period of the Omer. And for those of you who are counting or learning about counting the Omer, traditionally we say a blessing the night as the new day begins, which of course for Jews is at night. And then we announce the day. And then there are other kinds of meditative practices or intentional practices where we can focus our attention on these different qualities each week and then each day within each week. Lots of different ways to use this time spiritually, but the core ritual is simply to say a blessing for the mitzvah of counting the Omer and then to announce the new day. Not that hard to actually do. Very hard to remember if you are a human. I was going to say if you have a busy life, but even if you don't have a busy life, I think it can be a really challenging practice. So in the past couple of years, I've been very sort of self-satisfied that I've been able to count each night without forgetting a single one. And this year, I have so far, it's not over, I have forgotten to count the Omer on 2 nights. So here's what I want to say about that. First of all, there is a Jewish halachic provision that if you in fact forget, which I love, there's an acknowledgement that that is possible, and it's not something horrible, it is just human. If you forget, once you remember and you've already reached the next day, you still say the declaration of the new day, even of the Omer, even without a blessing. So I just love that there's a provision for the times when we forget. The second thing is that it was really an invitation for me this year to practice giving myself a little grace, which after all is what receiving Torah at Mount Sinai is all about in my mind. So I try to remember, and I've done a pretty good job, and I try to use this practice mindfully and in a way that enriches my soul and, God willing, the way I interact with the world. But in the moments when I have forgotten, I've really tried to use this as an opportunity to have some compassion for myself and know that because there is a provision for the moments that we forget, I certainly stand on a great tradition of other people who have forgotten along the way, but then found their way back, which is also a core part of spiritual practice. Acknowledging when we have strayed, when we have lost focus or disconnected from our intention or just fallen off the path, and then reconnecting, re-engaging with our practice. So that's number 1, compassion for when we forget, and an opportunity specifically to do that with the Omer practice, which lasts a pretty long time in terms of sustaining a daily practice. The second thing that I wanted to share is the fact that this last week of counting the Omer always coincides with the new book of the Torah, which we're beginning, which we'll read this Shabbat, Bamidbar, which is the first chapter or the first Torah portion in the book of what we call Numbers in English. But Bamidbar means in the wilderness. So we acknowledge that we receive Torah, the holiday of Shavuot, takes place within the context of reading the Torah and the fact that we received the Torah in the wilderness. Mount Sinai was in the wilderness. It wasn't in the land, so to speak. So why is this? Why receive the Torah in the wilderness? Well, I am not the first one to ask this question. There is considerable rabbinic literature, amazing, beautiful, fascinating midrashim, stories and ancient lore and legend about why it is that we receive Torah in the wilderness. But I want to share just a couple of ideas about why we might receive Torah in the wilderness as I'm reflecting on it this year. So the first is that one of the things that happens when we're wandering in the wilderness, and I mean not only the physical wilderness, but the wilderness of our lives, is that we realize usually how great of an expanse the natural world is with formidable challenges, and how small we actually are. Not unimportant, but small in the big scheme of things. And as a corollary, how much we need other people, that we can't do it alone. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about why sort of receive Torah in the wilderness, why center the wilderness in this climactic moment of our people's journey, is precisely to remember that none of us get through life alone, and that the wilderness reminds us of our need for connection and the ways in which we are wired for connection and for relationship. The second, that Torah is not a solo endeavor. It's a communal endeavor. The second is that it's a reminder for hope. You know, we haven't arrived when we get to Mount Sinai. We're at an important point along the journey, but we're not there yet. And we're still working towards something greater. It's not just about receiving the Torah, but then it's about bringing the Torah and its wisdom to life in community, in society, in our broken world. And so it reminds us to have sort of a growth mindset, an orientation towards we're not there yet, let's keep going. And gives us reason to be hopeful that we can continue to do that. And finally, I've been thinking about how if anybody's ever traveled in the wilderness, in nature, especially in challenging terrain, there's a tendency for that experience to bring out all kinds of shadowy parts inside of ourselves, kind of ghosts, and things that tend to linger. Those in challenging moments, those parts of ourselves that are less developed or cause us pain or are just unresolved tend to make themselves known. And I think that this is part of what Torah is there, after all, to teach us, which is to help us to encounter those parts of ourselves, those shadows, those ghosts, not just the beautiful, bright, shiny, highly evolved parts of ourselves, but the parts of ourselves that linger in the shadows, the parts of ourselves that we may be ashamed of, that we may need to give some loving attention. The Torah is there to help us do that ultimately. And the wilderness brings out those parts just by the nature of being a challenging environment. So those are some of my musings. I invite us all to consider, what's the connection between receiving Torah and moving through the wilderness? Again, not only the physical wilderness, although that is also important, but our own inner wilderness. And how might the Torah be a guide, be the instruction that we need in the current wilderness that we're facing, each as a community and as each one of us as an individual soul traveling through this brief time that we have here on earth. All right, everyone, wishing you sustained energy and mindfulness as we finish out this week of counting the Omer and moving into Shavuot, Motzei Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat on Saturday night. Peace. Shalom.